Princess Lyrael stood on the highest balcony of the Crystal Palace, and her silver eyes watched the dark smoke rising from the mountains in the distance, and she felt her heart growing heavier with each passing moment because everything she had ever known was falling apart around her. The sun was setting over Ethermoor, and the floating islands that had been her home for all her life now seemed fragile and vulnerable against the backdrop of orange and purple sky, and she could see the fires burning on 3 of the outer colonies where the humans had landed their massive metal ships just weeks ago. Beside her stood Veilrath, and he was magnificent, beyond words, with scales that shimmered between deep blue and silver gray like storm clouds gathering before a tempest, and he was larger than most buildings, with wings that could create hurricane winds when he flew, and his eyes glowed with ancient intelligence that had seen centuries pass. They had been bonded since Lyrael was only 7 years old, and the connection between them was deeper than friendship or companionship because they shared thoughts and emotions and could feel each other even when separated by great distances, and right now, Veilrath was feeling her fear and anger and determination all at once. The Silveran people had lived in peace for 3,000 years, and they had built their civilization among the floating islands using magic and harmony with nature, and their bond with dragons was sacred and unbreakable because it was formed through ancient rituals that connected souls together forever. But then the humans came from the stars in ships that blotted out the sun, and they spoke words of peace and cooperation, while their eyes looked greedily at the glowing crystals that grew naturally throughout Ethermoor and powered everything the Silveran had built. Lady Kara approached from behind, moving quietly across the smooth crystal floor, and she was Lyrael's most trusted advisor and oldest friend, and her face was grave with worry as she carried reports from the outer territories, and none of the news was good. She spoke in a low voice about how the human forces had taken control of the mining sites on the eastern islands, and how they were forcing Silvaran workers to extract crystals at a pace that would damage the natural balance, and when some of the workers had protested, the humans had responded with violence. 3 colonies had already fallen completely under human control, and the report said that families were being separated, and the dragons bonded to those people were being killed or captured and used for experiments, and the thought of it made Lyrael feel sick with rage. Kara continued speaking and told how the human commander had sent messages demanding that the Silveran government surrender all crystal mining rights and accept human oversight of their civilization, and if they refused, the humans promised to use overwhelming military force. Lyrael closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to maintain the composure expected of a princess, because her people were watching and they needed to see strength and confidence, even though inside she felt terrified and lost. She had studied everything she could find about humans before they arrived, and she knew they were a young species compared to the Silveran, and they had spread across many star systems through conquest and colonization, and they had powerful technology, but seemed to lack wisdom about how to use it. Some human cultures valued honor and art and philosophy, but others were driven purely by greed and the desire for power. And unfortunately, it seemed the ones who had come to Ethermoor were the latter type. Veilrath shifted beside her and made a low rumbling sound deep in his chest that vibrated through the balcony floor, and she knew he wanted to act and to fight and to burn the human ships from the sky, but she placed her hand on his neck and sent calming thoughts through their bond. She told him through their connection that they needed to be smart about this because rushing into battle without a plan would only get their people killed, and they needed to gather their forces and understand their enemy better before making any moves. But even as she thought this, she knew that time was running out, because every day the humans grew stronger and took more territory and enslaved more of her people, and soon it would be too late to mount any effective resistance. Lyrael turned to Kara and spoke with a voice that was steady, despite the storm raging inside her, and she gave orders that needed to be carried out immediately if they were going to have any chance of survival. She commanded that messengers be sent to every dragon sanctuary across all the floating islands, and that the ancient pact be invoked for the first time in 1,000 years, and this pact called all dragons and their bonded riders to come together in defense of their homeland. The last time the pact had been used was during the War of Shadows, when an interdimensional threat had tried to consume Ethermore, and the combined might of all dragons had barely been enough to push back the darkness. Kara nodded and hurried away to carry out the orders, and Lyra watched her go before turning back to look at the horizon where more smoke was rising, and she wondered if she was making the right choice or if she was about to lead her entire civilization into destruction. Veilrath moved closer and wrapped one of his massive wings around her protectively, and she leaned against his warm scales and felt some of her fear ease, because whatever happened next, they would face it together. She thought about her parents who had died when she was young, and how they had taught her that a true leader serves their people rather than ruling over them, and that sometimes the hardest choices are the most necessary ones. The crystal palace around her had stood for millennia, and its walls held the memories and history of countless generations, and she could feel the weight of all those who had come before her and all those who would come after, if she succeeded in protecting them. As night fell across Ethermore, the first responses to her summons began arriving, and she saw dragons of all sizes and colors rising into the darkening sky and flying toward the capital city from every direction. There were young drakes, barely bigger than horses, and ancient worms whose scales had turned nearly black with age, and there were sky serpents whose bodies twisted through the clouds like ribbons of light, and mountain dragons whose footsteps shook the ground. Each one carried a rider bonded to them through the sacred ritual, and together they represented the full strength of the Silvaran civilization, and Lyra felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time since the humans arrived. She descended from the balcony and made her way to the great hall where her war council was gathering, and these were the generals and strategists and scholars who would help her plan their defense. The hall was vast, with a ceiling that seemed to touch the sky, and the walls were made of living crystal that pulsed with soft light, and in the center was a massive table carved from a single piece of ancient stone. Maps and charts were spread across the table showing the layout of all the floating islands and the positions of human forces and the locations of crystal deposits and strategic strong points. General Thorn was already there studying the maps, and he was a veteran warrior whose own dragon had died in battle years ago, and the loss had left him bitter, but no less dedicated to protecting their people. He looked up as Lyra entered and bowed respectfully before launching into a detailed analysis of their tactical situation, and none of it was encouraging because the humans had superior numbers and technology. But Lyra listened carefully and asked questions and began to form a plan in her mind because she knew that the Silvaran had advantages too, and they knew this terrain intimately, and they had magic and dragons, and most importantly, they were fighting for their home. As the meeting continued late into the night, more and more dragons arrived and landed in the fields surrounding the palace, and their roars echoed through the darkness like thunder announcing a coming storm. Lyra stood at the window watching them arrive, and she felt Veilrath's presence in her mind strong and reassuring, and she sent him a thought, asking if he was ready for what was coming. His response was immediate and fierce and full of fire, and he told her that he had been ready since the moment the first human ship entered their atmosphere, and that he would burn anyone who threatened his bonded partner or their home. She smiled, despite the gravity of the situation, because Veilrath had always been dramatic and passionate, and it was one of the things she loved most about him. The War Council continued planning through the night, and by dawn they had a strategy that might work, if they were lucky and brave and willing to sacrifice everything for their freedom. Lyra knew that many would die in the coming battle, and the thought of it made her want to weep, but she also knew that surrender would mean a different kind of death, and a slower one, where her people lost their culture and identity and became slaves in their own homeland. As the sun rose on a new day, she stood before the assembled dragons and riders and spoke to them about courage and sacrifice and the price of freedom, and her voice carried across the gathering amplified by magic. She told them that she did not know if they would win, but she knew they had to try, and that future generations would remember this moment and judge them by the choices they made right now. The dragons roared their approval, and the sound was deafening and full of defiance, and Lirael felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness, but of pride and determination. Vilrath stood beside her and spread his wings wide, and lightning crackled between his scales, and in that moment, Lirael knew that whatever happened next, they would face it as they had always faced everything together with courage, and with Fire Commander Claire Murphy stood in the command center of the UHS Valiant and studied the holographic displays that showed tactical information about the current military situation on Ethermoor, and everything appeared to be proceeding according to the mission parameters that had been laid out 3 months ago. She was a career soldier with 15 years of combat experience across multiple war zones, and she had earned her rank through skill and dedication rather than political connections, and her crew respected her because she led from the front and never asked them to take risks she would not take herself. The command center was filled with the soft glow of dozens of monitors and the quiet hum of advanced technology, and officers moved efficiently between stations coordinating the ground forces that were securing territory across the floating islands. Lieutenant Maya Brooks approached, carrying a datapad with the latest intelligence reports, and her expression was professional, but Claire could see tension in her shoulders, and that was unusual because Maya rarely showed stress. Even in difficult situations, Maya reported that 3 more mining sites had been secured and that resistance from the local population had been minimal, and the crystal extraction operations were ahead of schedule and everything seemed to be going smoothly on the surface. But Claire had been doing this long enough to know that when things seemed too easy, it usually meant trouble was brewing somewhere out of sight, and her instincts were warning her that something was wrong, even though she could not identify what it was. The mission briefing had been very clear when they first arrived at Ethermoor, and the intelligence officers had explained that the Silvarin were a declining civilization clinging to outdated traditions and superstitions about their so-called sacred crystals. According to the briefing, the Silvarin had weapons of mass destruction hidden in their temples, and they had been making hostile gestures toward neighboring systems, and diplomatic attempts to negotiate had failed repeatedly because of their irrational leaders. The military assessment concluded that a swift show of force would convince the Silvarin to negotiate reasonably, and that minimal casualties would be necessary, and the whole operation was expected to take no more than 6 weeks before transitioning to peacekeeping and reconstruction. Claire had believed every word of it because she trusted the chain of command and the intelligence division, and she had no reason to think they would mislead her about something this important. But now, 3 months into the campaign, she was starting to notice inconsistencies and things that did not match what she had been told, and it was making her uncomfortable in a way she could not fully articulate. The Silvarin people she had encountered did not seem like dangerous fanatics, and they seemed more like ordinary civilians caught in a situation they did not understand, and their resistance was defensive rather than aggressive. And then there were the dragons, which had been described in the briefing as ceremonial creatures used in festivals and parades and as symbols of cultural heritage, but not as actual military assets. Claire had seen recordings of the dragons, and they were beautiful and majestic, but the briefing assured her they were not a significant tactical concern, and that modern weapons technology made them obsolete as combat units. Lieutenant Grace Holloway called out from the tactical station, and her voice had an edge of alarm that made everyone in the command center look up and pay attention because Grace never panicked about anything. She reported massive energy signatures converging on the capital city from all directions, and the scanners were picking up hundreds of targets moving through the atmosphere at high speed, and the computer was identifying them as biological life forms. Claire moved quickly to the tactical display and watched as the holographic map filled with red dots representing incoming contacts, and there were far more than she had expected, and they were moving with coordinated precision that suggested military discipline. The computer enhanced the images, and suddenly Claire was looking at live footage of dragons, and not the small ceremonial ones from the briefing, but massive creatures the size of frigates with wingspans that blocked out the sun. She watched as one dragon tore through a squadron of atmospheric drones with what appeared to be electrical breath weapon, and the drones were advanced military hardware worth millions of credits each, and they were destroyed in seconds. Another dragon generated a force field that deflected missile fire, and a third one moved with impossible agility for something so large and dodged through defensive fire like it could predict where the shots would go before they were fired. Claire felt her stomach drop because this changed everything, and if the dragons were this powerful, then the entire tactical assessment had been catastrophically wrong, and they were not facing a declining civilization, but a military force. They were unprepared to fight. She immediately ordered all atmospheric fighters to scramble and requested emergency support from Admiral Patterson and began implementing defensive protocols, but part of her mind was racing through implications. If the intelligence about the dragons was this wrong, then what else in the briefing had been false, and why had they been given such inaccurate information about a target they were invading? Maya appeared at her shoulder and spoke quietly, so only Claire could hear, and she said that something about this whole operation had never felt right, and that the official story had too many holes in it. Before Claire could respond, Grace called out again with new information, and this time her voice had a note of confusion, because a single figure was approaching the human defensive perimeter under a white flag of truce. The scanners identified the figure as Princess Lyrael herself, accompanied only by her personal dragon and carrying no weapons and requesting a meeting with the human commander. Claire felt multiple conflicting emotions because this could be a trap, but it could also be an opportunity, and her tactical training said to refuse, but her instincts said this was important. She made a decision that might cost her career and agreed to meet the princess in a neutral location, and she specified the ruins of an old temple that had been damaged during the initial landing operations. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Karen Foster, argued that it was too dangerous and that the princess could be planning an assassination, but Claire overruled her and said they would take every precaution but the meeting would happen. She selected a security team to accompany her and made sure they had full sensor coverage of the area and arranged for air support on standby and prepared herself mentally for whatever was coming. As she walked through the corridors of the Valiant toward the shuttle bay, she thought about her career and all the wars she had fought and all the enemies she had faced. She had always believed she was fighting for something worthwhile, and that the missions she undertook served a greater good and protected innocent people from threats. But lately, she had been having doubts because some of the orders she received seemed more focused on corporate interests than actual security threats, and the justifications for military action seemed increasingly thin. She remembered a mission 2 years ago where she had been ordered to secure a mining colony, and the official story said they were liberating it from pirates. But when she arrived, the so-called pirates were just local workers protesting unfair labor conditions. She had refused to fire on civilians and had been reprimanded for it and nearly court-martialed before a sympathetic superior officer had buried the incident in paperwork. That experience had taught her that the military machine she served was not always as righteous as it claimed to be, and that sometimes the real story was very different from the official narrative. The shuttle ride to the temple ruins was tense, and Claire used the time to review everything she knew about Princess Lyra L from the intelligence files. The files said she was young and inexperienced, and had inherited the Peton throne after her parents died, and that she was influenced by radical advisors who opposed any cooperation with other species. But the files also included images of her, and Claire studied them carefully, and she saw intelligence in those silver eyes and determination in the set of her jaw, and she did not look like a puppet ruler. The shuttle landed near the temple, and Claire stepped out wearing her combat armor, but with her helmet retracted because she wanted the princess to see her face. The temple had been beautiful once with towering crystal pillars and intricate carvings, but now it was a ruin with shattered columns and scorched walls, and Claire felt a pang of regret looking at the destruction. She walked forward slowly, scanning the area for threats, and then she saw Princess Lyra L standing in the center of the ruins with her dragon, Valrath, behind her. The princess was tall and graceful, and moved with a fluid elegance that seemed almost unnatural, and her silver hair caught the sunlight, and her eyes glowed faintly with an inner light. Claire stopped about 10 meters away, and the two women regarded each other across the space, and Claire felt the weight of the moment because everything that happened next could determine the fate of this entire world. She noticed that Lyra L looked tired despite her composed exterior, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the burden of leadership. The dragon Valrath was even more impressive up close, and his scales shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and flow, and his eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. Claire spoke first because protocol dictated that as the one who agreed to the meeting, she should open the conversation, and she asked why the princess had come personally when she could have sent an ambassador. Lyra L replied in a voice that was musical but also firm, and she said that some conversations required direct communication between leaders and that she wanted to look into the eyes of the person commanding the forces that were destroying her world. Claire felt those words hit harder than she expected, and she maintained her professional composure, but inside, she felt something shift and crack. The princess asked her a question that cut straight to the heart of everything, and she asked if Claire even knew why she was really here, and what the true purpose of this invasion was. Claire started to give the official answer about weapons and threats and diplomatic failures, but the words felt hollow in her mouth, and she could hear how unconvincing they sounded. Lyra L listened patiently, and then began to speak about her people and their history and their relationship with the dragons and how they had lived in peace for thousands of years. She explained that the crystals were not just resources to be mined, but living parts of their ecosystem, and that taking them too quickly would destroy the natural balance and eventually kill the planet. She told Claire about how her people had welcomed the first human explorers with hospitality, and had been willing to share knowledge and culture, but had refused to sell their sacred crystals because doing so would violate their deepest beliefs. And then the humans had left and returned with warships and demands, and had started taking by force what they could not obtain through negotiation. Claire listened, and felt her certainty beginning to crumble because this version of events made more sense than the official briefing, and it explained many of the inconsistencies she had noticed. Lyra L stepped closer, and Claire tensed, but did not reach for her weapon, and the princess stopped just a few feet away, and Claire could see the pain and determination in her alien features. The princess spoke about humanity, and said she had studied their history and their culture, and she knew they were capable of both tremendous good and terrible evil. She said she believed that Claire was different from the system that had sent her, and that maybe there was still a chance to end this without complete destruction. Claire felt something breaking inside her because she wanted to believe the princess, but doing so would mean questioning everything she had been told, and everything she had done. The neutral zone was a place of broken beauty and shattered dreams, where crystal pillars lay scattered across scorched ground, like the bones of some ancient giant, and the air still smelled of smoke and destruction from the battles that had raged here weeks before Princess Lyrael dismounted from Veilrath with practiced grace, and her bare feet touched the warm stone, and she felt the lingering pain of this sacred place that had once been a temple where her ancestors had worshipped and celebrated life. She wore robes of deep violet that seemed to shimmer and flow like water, even in the still air, and her silver hair was pulled back in a simple braid that hung down to her waist, and she carried no weapons because she had come here to talk, not to fight. Every step toward the center of the ruins required immense effort, because trying to stay composed when the alien princess finally met the human warrior face to face was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and her hands wanted to shake, but she forced them to remain steady at her sides because showing weakness now would undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. Behind her Veilrath watched with glowing eyes, and she could feel his protective instincts through their bond, and he was ready to incinerate anyone who threatened her, but she sent him calming thoughts and told him to trust her judgment. From the opposite side of the ruins, Commander Claire Murphy emerged, and Lyrael studied her carefully, because understanding this human would be crucial to everything that followed. Claire wore advanced combat armor that gleamed dully in the sunlight, and the armor was designed for both protection and intimidation, but she had removed her helmet, and Lyrael could see her face clearly. The human commander had strong features and short brown hair, and eyes that were sharp and intelligent, and there was something in her expression that Lyrael recognized because she saw the same thing in her own mirror every morning. It was the look of someone who carried too much responsibility and made decisions that kept them awake at night and wondered if they were doing the right thing. The two women stood facing each other across 10 meters of devastated sacred ground, and the moment stretched out and became heavy with possibility, because what happened here could change the fate of entire civilizations. Lyrael could see Claire's security team positioned around the perimeter with weapons ready, and she knew that Veilrath could kill them all in seconds if necessary, but she desperately hoped it would not come to that. Claire spoke first, and her voice was rougher than Lyrael expected, and more direct, and she asked why the princess had come personally. Instead of sending a diplomat or ambassador, Lyrael took a breath and replied that some conversations required looking into someone's eyes and seeing their truth, and that she needed to understand the person who was commanding the forces destroying her world. She saw something flicker in Claire's expression, and it might have been surprise or discomfort or perhaps recognition, and Lyrael pressed her advantage by asking the question that mattered most. She asked Claire if she truly knew why she was here, and what the real purpose of this invasion was, and whether anyone had told her the whole truth about what was happening. Claire started to give what sounded like a rehearsed answer about weapons and threats and failed negotiations. But Lyrael could hear the doubt creeping into her voice and see the uncertainty in her eyes. The commander explained what she had been told in the mission briefing about the Silverin having weapons of mass destruction and refusing reasonable diplomatic contact and posing a threat to regional stability. Lyrael listened without interrupting, and when Claire finished, she felt a wave of anger and sadness because she realized that this human warrior had been lied to just as thoroughly as Lyrael people had been betrayed. She began to speak, and her voice was calm but carried the weight of 3,000 years of history, and she told Claire about her people and their civilization. The Silverin had lived in harmony with the dragons since before humans had left their home planet, and the bond between them was sacred and formed through rituals that connected souls across lifetimes. She explained that the glowing crystals that humans wanted so desperately were not just minerals, but living parts of the planet ecosystem, and they grew slowly over centuries, and harvesting them too quickly would kill Ethermore. Her people had welcomed the first human explorers 5 years ago and had offered to share their knowledge of magic and dragon bonding and the mysteries of crystal growth. But when the humans asked to buy unlimited quantities of crystals for their technology, the Silverin had refused because doing so would be like selling their own children. The explorers had left disappointed, and Lirael had thought that was the end of it. But then the warships arrived with demands and ultimatums and then with weapons. Claire was listening intently now, and Lirael could see her processing this information and comparing it to what she had been told, and finding the inconsistencies. Lirael gestured to Veilrath and spoke about the dragons, and explained that they were not weapons or tools, but individuals with their own thoughts and personalities and desires. She described the bonding ritual where a young Silverin and a young dragon chose each other, and how their souls became intertwined, and they could feel each other's emotions and share thoughts across any distance. Veilrath had chosen her when she was 7 years old and terrified after her parents' death, and he had been there through every moment of joy and sorrow since then, and losing him would be like losing half of herself. She asked Claire to imagine what it would be like if someone came and killed her closest friend or family member and called it military necessity, and that was what the humans were doing to her people. Claire's face had gone pale, and Lirael could see her struggling with something internal, and she knew this was the moment that mattered most. Lirael took several steps closer until she was only a few feet away and close enough to see the flecks of green in Claire's brown eyes and the small scar on her left cheek. She spoke more softly now and said that she had studied humanity extensively before the invasion, and she knew their history of both conquest and compassion. Humans had committed terrible atrocities, but they had also produced great artists and philosophers and heroes who fought for justice, and she believed that people were not born good or evil, but made choices. She looked directly into Claire's eyes and said that she believed this commander was someone who cared about doing the right thing, and that maybe she was different from the system that had sent her. Claire looked back at her, and Lirael could see walls crumbling behind those eyes, and see the warrior beginning to question everything she thought she knew. The human commander spoke, and her voice was quieter now, and she asked how Lirael could be sure that this was not just propaganda designed to manipulate her emotions. Lirael smiled sadly and replied that she could not prove anything beyond doubt, but she could offer truth and let Claire judge for herself whether it rang true. She invited Claire to come to the capital city and see how the Silverin lived and meet families whose members had been killed or enslaved and visit the Pach dragon sanctuaries and learn about the culture that was being destroyed. Claire was silent for a long moment, and Lirael could see her thinking and calculating and weighing risks against potential rewards. Behind them, both the dragons and the soldiers watched tensely, and everyone knew that this conversation could end in either peace or bloodshed, depending on what happened next. Finally, Claire spoke and said that she would need time to investigate certain things, and that she could not promise anything, but she would look into the claims Lirael had made. Lirael felt hope rising in her chest, but kept her expression neutral, because she knew that this was just the first step, and there was still a long way to go. She told Claire that time was something they had very little of, because every day more of her people died and more territory fell. And soon it might be too late to stop the momentum toward total war. Claire nodded slowly and said she understood and that she would move as quickly as possible, but that overturning military operations required evidence and careful planning. Lirael asked what kind of evidence would be convincing, and Claire thought about it, and then listed several things, including original intelligence reports and communications records and witness testimony from multiple sources. The princess said she would see what her intelligence network could provide, and that perhaps they could meet again in 3 days to share information. Claire agreed to this, and the two women stood there for another moment just looking at each other, and Lirael felt a strange connection forming Despite all the reasons they should be enemies, she realized that they were not so different, because they were both leaders trying to protect their people, and both struggling with impossible choices, and both wanting to do what was right. Even when the path was unclear, Claire seemed to be thinking something similar, because she said quietly that she had not expected the princess to be like this. Lirael asked what she had expected, and Claire admitted that the briefing had described her as young and inexperienced, and easily manipulated by radical advisors. The princess laughed, and the sound was like bells, but with a bitter edge, and she said that it was interesting how those in power always described those who opposed them as naive, or radical, or dangerous. Claire actually smiled slightly at that, and agreed that it was a common pattern, and then her expression became serious again. She said that if what Lirael claimed was true, then there would be consequences and people would be held accountable, but it would take time and evidence and political will. Lirael replied that her people did not have the luxury of time, but she understood the constraints Claire operated under, and she would accept whatever help the commander could provide. They agreed on a secure communication channel and emergency protocols and rules for their next meeting, and then it was time to part ways. Lirael walked back to Vaelrath and climbed onto his back and looked down at Claire one more time, and she said that she hoped they were beginning something important here today. Claire looked up at her and said she hoped so too. But that hope was a dangerous thing in war, and that they both needed to be prepared for the possibility that this would not end well. Lirael agreed, and then Vaelrath launched himself into the air with powerful beats of his wings, and they rose above the ruined temple and headed back toward the capital. As they flew, Lirael thought about the meeting and analyzed everything Claire had said and how she had said it, and she felt cautiously optimistic. The human commander had a conscience, and that was both her strength and her weakness, and Lirael would need to appeal to that conscience, while also being realistic about what one person could accomplish against an entire military machine. Vaelrath rumbled a question through their bond and asked if she really trusted the human, and Lirael replied honestly that she did not fully trust anyone she had just met, but she believed Claire was genuinely conflicted and that conflict could be leveraged into action if they played this carefully and provided the right evidence at the right time. The dragon expressed concern that this might be a trap and that meeting alone with the enemy commander again could be dangerous. Lirael acknowledged the risk, but said that sometimes the greatest danger came from not taking risks, and that if they did not try to find another path, then war was inevitable. And in a total war against the human military machine, with its superior numbers and technology, the Silvarin would eventually lose no matter how bravely they fought. So trying to turn the human commander into an ally was perhaps their best chance for survival, even if the odds of success were small. As the capital came into view ahead, Lirael steeled herself for the next challenge, which would be convincing her own war council that negotiating with the enemy was not a sign of weakness, but of strategic thinking. Commander Claire Murphy sat alone in her private quarters aboard the Valiant and stared at the data screens that surrounded her like accusing witnesses, and she felt the foundations of everything she believed beginning to crack and crumble. It was over 300 hours, and she had not slept in 2 days, because she had been using every backdoor access code and security clearance she possessed to dig through classified files that she was probably not supposed to see. Her old mentor, Admiral Helen Martinez, had given her emergency override codes years ago during a classified operation and had told her to use them only if she ever suspected something was fundamentally wrong with a mission. Helen had been forced into early retirement after questioning orders one too many times, and before she left, she had pulled Claire aside and told her that the military she loved was being corrupted from within by corporate interests. At the time, Claire had nodded politely but had not really believed it because she trusted the system and thought Helen was just bitter about her career ending. Now sitting here surrounded by evidence of systematic deception, she wished she could apologize to her mentor for doubting her words. The files she had accessed painted a very different picture from the official briefing she had received about Ethermore, and every layer she uncovered revealed more lies and manipulation. 5 years ago, a corporate survey team from Meridian Mining Consortium had discovered the crystal deposits on Ethermore, and initial analysis showed they were the most efficient energy storage medium ever found. The crystals could power starships for years without refueling and could be used in weapons systems and medical equipment and 1,000 other applications, and they were worth more than entire planetary economies. Meridian had sent a trade delegation to negotiate mining rights, but the Silverin had refused to sell or trade the crystals because they considered them sacred and integral to their planetary ecosystem. The corporate records showed multiple attempts at negotiation and bribery and intimidation, but the Silverin would not budge from their position, and eventually the delegation left empty-handed. That should have been the end of it. But instead, Meridian had launched a sophisticated campaign to manufacture a crisis that would justify military intervention. They hired mercenaries to stage attacks on human colonies, using stolen Silverin technology and fabricated evidence of weapons development, and paid off intelligence analysts to write threat assessments that painted the Silverin as dangerous and unstable. Every diplomatic incident that the briefing had mentioned was carefully orchestrated to make it look like the Silverin were refusing reasonable negotiations and being hostile to human interests. The so-called weapons of mass destruction were actually ancient temple artifacts that had no military application, and the threat to regional stability was completely invented. Claire felt physically ill reading through the communications between Meridian executives and high-ranking military officials discussing how to create the pretext for invasion. The worst part was seeing names she recognized, including some of the people who had personally briefed her on this mission and assured her that everything was legitimate and necessary. She found video files showing corporate agents disguised as Silverin attacking human settlements, and the attacks were brutal and designed to generate maximum outrage and support for military action. There were financial records showing millions of credits being transferred to politicians and military procurement officers and media companies to shape the narrative. The entire war was a corporate venture, dressed up in military uniforms and draped in patriotic rhetoric about protecting human interests and spreading civilization. Claire thought about all the Silverin she had killed or captured over the past 3 months, and she thought about the families torn apart and the homes destroyed and the sacred sites bombed. She had done all of that based on lies, and she had led her soldiers to commit acts that now looked like war crimes rather than legitimate military operations. Lieutenant Grace Holloway found her sitting there at dawn, still staring at screens full of incriminating evidence, and Grace's face showed immediate concern. She asked if the commander was all right, and Claire laughed harshly and said she did not think anyone involved in this operation was all right. Grace closed the door behind her and sat down across from Claire and asked what she had found, and Claire gestured at the screens. She explained everything she had uncovered about the corporate conspiracy and the manufactured crisis and the systematic deception, and Grace's face went pale as she absorbed the implications. Grace was quiet for a long time, and then she said that she had suspected something was wrong, but had not wanted to believe it, and had convinced herself she was just being paranoid. Claire asked if any of the other officers had similar doubts, and Grace said that Lieutenant Maya Brooks had made comments about inconsistencies in the intelligence reports. They agreed to bring Maya into the conversation, and within an hour, the 3 of them were reviewing the evidence together and discussing what to do next. Maya pointed out that if they brought this information to the attention of Admiral Patterson, he would likely bury it, because he was probably already aware of the true situation. Claire agreed, and said they needed to assume that anyone above them in the chain of command was either complicit or compromised, and that going through normal channels would be suicide. Grace suggested they could leak the information to independent media outlets, but Maya argued that by the time the story got traction, it would be too late for the Silverin. Claire sat back and thought about Princess Lyrael and the meeting in the temple ruins, and how the princess had looked at her with those silver eyes full of desperate hope. She realized that Lyrael had probably suspected the truth about the corporate conspiracy, but had given Claire a chance to discover it herself, because being told would not have been as convincing as finding the evidence personally. The princess was smarter than the intelligence files had suggested, and she was playing a dangerous game, trying to turn an enemy commander into an ally. Claire made a decision that would end her career and possibly her life, but it was the only decision she could live with going forward. She told Maya and Grace that she was going to provide the evidence to Princess Lyrael and coordinate with the Silverin to expose the conspiracy. Both lieutenants looked shocked, and Maya pointed out that this was treason by any definition, and that they would all be court-martialed and probably executed. Claire acknowledged this, but said that following illegal orders was also a crime, and that they had a moral obligation to stop a genocide, even if it meant sacrificing their careers. She told them they could walk away now, and she would not hold it against them, and would keep their names out of everything. Grace and Maya looked at each other, and some unspoken communication passed between them. And then Grace said that she was in, because she had not joined the military to be a corporate enforcer. Maya nodded and said she was in too because her family had not escaped oppression on their homeworld, just so she could inflict the same thing on someone else. Claire felt gratitude and fear in equal measure because now she was not just risking her own life, but the lives of people who trusted her. They spent the next several hours copying files and encrypting data and preparing a comprehensive evidence package that could not be dismissed as fabrication. Claire also began drafting a message to Princess Lyrael, requesting an urgent meeting and including enough evidence to prove her good faith. She knew this would paint a target on her back, and that powerful people would want her dead. But she also knew she could not live with herself if she did nothing. As she worked, she thought about all the wars she had fought and all the justifications she had accepted without question, and she wondered how many of them had been based on similar lies. The military had been her life for 15 years, and she had dedicated herself to serving something greater than herself. And now she was learning that much of what she had served was rotten at the core. It was like discovering that your parents were criminals, and that your entire childhood had been built on stolen money. Lieutenant Karen Foster entered without knocking, and her face was flushed with anger, and she demanded to know what was going on, because rumors were spreading that the commander was investigating the mission parameters. Claire made a split-second decision and decided to trust Karen with the truth, because trying to hide it at this point would be impossible. She showed Karen the evidence and watched her face go through shock and denial and anger, and finally, grim acceptance. Karen said quietly that her brother had died in one of the attacks that were supposedly carried out by Silverin terrorists. And if those attacks were actually staged, then his death was murder, not combat casualty. Claire put a hand on her shoulder and said she was sorry, and Karen just nodded, because there were no words adequate for that kind of betrayal. They now had 4 officers conspiring to commit treason, and Claire knew they needed to act fast before someone reported them to Admiral Patterson. She sent the encrypted message to Lyrael using the secure channel they had established and requested a meeting within 24 hours. The response came back in less than an hour, and Lyrael agreed to meet at a different location and suggested bringing whatever evidence Claire had discovered. Claire began preparing for the meeting and selecting which files to bring and thinking about how to present this information in a way that would be useful. She also began thinking about what would happen after the evidence was made public, because there would be consequences that rippled through the entire military and political structure. Powerful people had invested heavily in this war, and they would not give up their profits without a fight, and they would use every resource at their disposal to discredit or eliminate anyone who threatened them. But Claire had crossed the line now, and there was no going back, and she found that she felt lighter somehow, despite the danger. Living with the truth, even when it was ugly and dangerous, felt better than living with comfortable lies. Maya came to tell her that the shuttle was ready, and that the security team had been briefed on the meeting location but not on the actual purpose. Claire gathered her equipment and the evidence files and took one last look around her quarters because she knew she might never see them again. As she walked through the corridors of the Valiant, she passed soldiers who saluted her and trusted her and believed they were fighting for a righteous cause. She wanted to tell them all the truth, but knew that would cause chaos, and she needed to handle this carefully to minimize casualties on both sides. The shuttle ride to the meeting location was tense, and Claire reviewed her presentation and anticipated questions and prepared for the possibility that this could all be an elaborate trap. But when she arrived and saw Princess Lyrael waiting with Veilrath and a small group of advisors, she knew this was real and that they were about to change everything. She stepped forward carrying the evidence that would expose the conspiracy and end the war and destroy her career and possibly save a civilization. Lyrael met her eyes and nodded once, and in that moment, trying to stay composed, the alien princess finally understood that the human warrior had chosen a side, and it was the side of truth, regardless of cost. The emergency alert came through every channel simultaneously, and it cut through the normal communications traffic like a knife through silk, and Admiral Victoria Hayes' voice was cold with authority as she broadcast across the entire fleet. She announced that Commander Claire Murphy was relieved of command effective immediately on charges of treason and conspiracy with enemy forces, and all ground units were to consider her a hostile target if she resisted arrest. Claire heard the announcement while she was in a planning session with Princess Lyrael and several Silvaran military leaders, and for a moment the room went completely silent. Then Grace burst in and reported that 12 additional warships had just dropped out of hyperspace, and they were corporate security vessels masquerading as military fleet, and they were moving into attack positions. Lyrael stood and moved to the window and looked up at the sky where the new ships were visible as bright points of light against the darkness, and her face was pale but determined. Claire felt time compressing around her because everything was happening too fast, and they had known the conspiracy would strike back, but she had not expected it to be this swift or this overwhelming. The corporate fleet was broadcasting its own message now, and it was calling this Operation Final Harvest and ordering all personnel to begin immediate resource extraction. Regardless of civilian casualties, Maya ran tactical projections and reported that the incoming fleet had enough firepower to destroy every major population center on Ethermore within 6 hours. Claire looked at the strategic displays and knew that her small group of loyalists could not stop this, and the Silvaran forces, even with their dragons, were outnumbered and outgunned. But then Lyrael did something unexpected, and she raised her hand high and spoke a single word in the ancient language of her people, and the word resonated with power across the entire planet. Dragons began to rise, and not just the hundreds that had gathered at the capital, but thousands from every sanctuary and breeding ground and wild territory. The sky filled with wings and scales and ancient power, as creatures that had lived for centuries emerged from hiding places and answered the call of their bonded princess. Claire watched in awe as the dragon formations organized themselves with military precision, and she realized the intelligence briefings had been wrong about everything because these were not ceremonial pets, but a sophisticated aerial force. Veilrath stood beside Lyrael, and lightning crackled between his scales, and his eyes blazed with barely contained fury, and through their bond the princess could feel his eagerness for battle. But she also felt something else, and it was the collective consciousness of every dragon on Ethermore connecting through some ancient network that humans did not understand and would never be able to replicate. Lieutenant Karen Foster approached Claire and reported that 20 of their soldiers had refused the recall order and were requesting permission to stand with the commander against the corporate fleet. Claire felt emotion threatening to overwhelm her because these men and women were sacrificing everything based on trust in her judgment, and she could not let them down. She turned to Lyra L. and said they needed to coordinate their forces and present a unified resistance, and the princess agreed immediately without hesitation. They worked together rapidly, designating targets and establishing communication protocols and creating a battle plan that integrated human technology with dragon capabilities. Maya pointed out that they were still massively outnumbered, and that even with the dragons they would take heavy casualties, and Claire agreed, but said they had to try. Grace suggested they broadcast the evidence of the corporate conspiracy on all channels so that at least the truth would be known even if they failed. Claire authorized this, and within minutes the files were being transmitted across the entire sector, showing the manufactured crisis and the fake attacks and the financial corruption. Some of the ships in the corporate fleet began breaking formation as their crews learned the truth and realized they were fighting for profit rather than security. Admiral Hayes tried to jam the transmissions, but it was too late because the information had already spread, and now there were arguments and confrontations happening on multiple vessels. Claire saw an opportunity and opened a direct channel to Hayes and offered her one chance to stand down and submit to investigation. Hayes responded with contempt and said that naive idealists like Claire never understood how the real world worked, and that force was the only thing that mattered. She ordered the corporate fleet to open fire, and suddenly the sky was filled with weapons, discharge and explosions, and the Battle of Ethermore had begun. Dragons dove through the defensive fire with impossible agility, and their breath weapons cut through shields and armor, and they moved like living storms. Veilwrath carried both Lyrael and Claire on his back, and it was a strange sensation for the human commander, because she could feel the dragon muscles moving beneath her and sense his emotions through the bond he shared with the princess. They led a formation that struck at the flagship where Admiral Hayes was coordinating the attack, and the other dragons followed their lead with devastating effectiveness. Human fighters that had defected to Claire's side flew alongside the dragons and provided covering fire and targeting data, and the coordination between the two species improved with every passing minute. Karen led a ground-day team that sabotaged the mining operations and freed enslaved Silvaran workers and disabled the extraction equipment that the corporations had installed. The battle raged for 3 days, without pause, and casualties mounted on both sides, and the floating islands of Ethermore burned with fires that could be seen from orbit. But slowly the tide began to turn because more ships defected from the corporate fleet as their crews learned the truth and refused to fight an unjust war. Admiral Hayes tried to maintain control, but her authority crumbled as evidence of the conspiracy spread and officers began questioning their orders. On the 3rd day, a cruiser commanded by Captain Linda Torres broke formation and opened fire on the flagship, forcing Hayes to divert resources to defend herself. Claire seized the opportunity and led a strike team aboard the flagship, while Veilwrath and the other dragons kept the defensive batteries occupied. They fought their way through corridors and engaged corporate security forces and finally reached the command center where Hayes was coordinating the battle. The Admiral stood surrounded by loyal guards, and she looked at Claire with contempt and said that this changed nothing because there would always be another war and another opportunity for profit. Claire replied that maybe so, but at least this time the people doing the fighting would know the truth about why they were fighting. Hayes reached for her sidearm, but Grace was faster and stunned her before she could fire, and within minutes the flagship was secured. With Hayes in custody, the remaining corporate vessels lost cohesion, and most of them surrendered while a few fled the system entirely. The Battle of Ethermore was over, but the cost had been terrible because hundreds of dragons had died and thousands of Silvaran and humans had been killed or wounded. Claire stood in the ruins of what had been a beautiful city and looked at the destruction and felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Lyrael found her there, and they stood together in silence for a while, because sometimes there are no words adequate for the aftermath of war. The princess said quietly that they had won, but it did not feel like victory, and Claire agreed, because winning at such cost felt more like survival than triumph. But they had exposed the conspiracy and stopped the genocide and forged an alliance between their peoples, and that had to count for something. Over the following weeks, investigators arrived from multiple governments, and the evidence Claire had provided led to arrests and trials and corporate dissolution. The Meridian Mining Consortium was dismantled, and its executives faced charges of war crimes and conspiracy and fraud. Claire herself faced a military tribunal, but the charges were dropped when the full extent of the conspiracy became public, and she was quietly reassigned to an advisory position. Many called her a hero, but she rejected the label because heroes did not have to make the choices she had made or live with the consequences of those choices. Lyrael worked tirelessly to rebuild her civilization and to care for the families who had lost loved ones and to heal the scars that war had left on her people. The two women maintained regular communication and developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared trauma, and the understanding that they had changed each other's lives forever. Years later, when historians studied the Battle of Ethermoor, they focused on the military tactics and the political implications and the precedent it set for corporate accountability. But those who had actually been there knew the real story was simpler and more profound because it was about two leaders who chose truth over convenience and courage over comfort. Lyrael would sometimes stand on her balcony at sunset with Veilrath beside her and remember that moment when she had decided to trust a human warrior, despite every reason not to. She would think about how, trying to stay composed, the alien princess had finally met the human warrior face to face and had found not an enemy, but a reflection of her own struggle to do what was right. Claire would visit Ethermoor occasionally and walk through the rebuilt cities and see Silverin children playing with young dragons, and she would feel proud of what they had accomplished. But she would also visit the memorial gardens, where the names of the dead were carved in crystal, and she would remember the price that had been paid for that accomplishment. The alliance between humans and Silverin grew stronger over time and became a model for interspecies cooperation and mutual respect. Trading agreements were established that respected the sacred nature of the crystals while allowing limited sustainable harvesting that benefited both civilizations. Dragon riders began training human pilots in aerial combat techniques, and humans shared technology that helped protect the floating islands from natural disasters. A joint military academy was established where soldiers from both species learned to work together, and the first graduating class included both Grace and Maya, who had become instructors. Karen Foster led the investigation division that hunted down remaining corporate conspirators and brought them to justice, and she did it with a determination that honored her brother. Memory Admiral Hayes spent the rest of her life in prison, and she never admitted wrongdoing or showed remorse, because some people are too invested in their own version of reality to see the truth. But her imprisonment sent a message that powerful people could be held accountable, and that message resonated across the galaxy. The crystal temples that had been destroyed were rebuilt, but this time with human architectural elements incorporated into the design as a symbol of unity. Children of both species grew up hearing stories about the Battle of Ethermoor and learning that courage sometimes meant standing against your own people when they were wrong. Lyrael eventually stepped down from her role as princess and became an ambassador working to prevent future wars through diplomacy and cultural exchange. Claire retired from military service and wrote a book about her experiences, and it became required reading in military academies as a cautionary tale about blindly following orders. On the anniversary of their first meeting in the temple ruins, they would gather there with Veilrath and other survivors and remember those who had fallen. They would speak about the cost of peace and the price of justice and the importance of questioning authority when authority demanded unconscionable actions, and they would reaffirm their commitment to the principles that had brought them together in the first place, which were simply that truth mattered and that all sentient beings deserved dignity and freedom. The story of the alien princess and the human warrior became legend, but those who lived it knew. It was really a story about choices and consequences and the courage to admit when you were wrong. It was about seeing past propaganda and prejudice to recognize the humanity or equivalent in those you had been taught to fear. It was about the bonds that could form between different species when they worked together toward common goals instead of fighting over resources. Most importantly, it was about hope, because even in the darkest moments of the battle, when victory seemed impossible, they had never stopped hoping for a better outcome. That hope had sustained them through 3 days of brutal combat and through the difficult years of reconstruction and reconciliation that followed. And that hope continued to inspire new generations who looked at the alliance between humans and Silverin and believed that a better future was possible if people were willing to fight for it. Veilwrath lived many more centuries and bonded with other Silverin after Lirael eventually passed away from old age, and each time he would remember the human commander who had ridden on his back into battle. He would tell younger dragons about the war and about how 2 leaders had changed the course of history through courage and conviction and mutual respect. And the story would continue to be told across worlds and generations, because some stories deserve to be remembered forever.